Sarah, you're happy for me to just start with an intro once you've got people in, or did you want to say anything? Or? Yeah.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Is Carmen a face I haven't seen for a while? Morning, Carmen. Standard Zoom, you're on mute.
I said, hey Matt, how you doing?
You'd have thought of 20 years of now doing this, we'd be pretty how Zoom works, right? Morning, is that Ilka?
Good morning. Yes, it's Ilker.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Matt. I am.
Morning, Ryan, Mike, Francis, and Alexandra. I think maybe we'll just wait another minute or two for anyone else that's joining a couple of minutes late, and then we'll get started.
I will. Good
morning, Emily joined.
I am.
Hello.
Okay, well, I can certainly start with the introduction, the script that I prepared earlier, and then hopefully if anyone else is a little bit late, they'll be ready to join the session. So just first off, quick check, you can all hear me all right, thumbs up just to make sure it's nice and clear. Super. So good morning, I'm Matt Coyne, Digital Director at Raccoon Events and founder of Twigged.io. Michael Adenya, who's chair of the Cross Association Working Group, was due to chair this session this morning, but sadly couldn't make it. So I'm afraid you have me this morning. Through this pandemic, I've also been running a podcast to help our industry look at what's next for them. So that's why I was super excited to sort of take part in the AO talks this morning. You can have a look at that or search for Waves Connects podcast. The AO has been running talks throughout its centenary year, 2021, to keep in touch with members on the issues that are important to them and the industry with content derived from the various working groups. Last week, the AO released a new diversity and inclusion resource on the AO Hub. So it's open to everyone, members and non-members, and it's got some amazing resources on it. So, you know, books, case studies, YouTube clips, TED Talks, white papers, etc. It's really brilliant. So thank you to everyone that's worked hard on putting that together, and you can access that via a link I will share in the chat in a moment. Today's talk is the Cross Association Diversity and Inclusion Group, which launched at the end of last year. As we celebrate Pride this month, we're delighted to bring in the third in the D&I talks for 2021, Beyond the Binary, with a focus on sexual orientation, raising LGBTQ+ awareness and understanding and inclusivity. Today we have Morgan Garrell as your speaker. Good morning, Morgan.
morning.
Morgan is an experienced therapist with a background in person-centered therapy and mindfulness-based approaches. They are also non-binary and have a passion for promoting equality and inclusion, helping to support LGBTQ+ people and spreading awareness around the issues they face. Morgan will provide roughly a 45-minute presentation and talk about gender identity and talk a little bit about their experience as a genderqueer non-binary person. The session will also cover gender identities, drawing from Morgan's lived experiences. I'll shortly hand over to Morgan to present the session and invite you to ask any questions throughout the talk. So feel free to use the little hand up icon or post a question in the chat, and we'll come to you as soon as we can. Alternatively, if you want to remain anonymous with your questions, please feel free to send a private note to myself or Sarah, and we'll ask those questions anonymously on your behalf. So Morgan, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, with the questions, we tested the slideshow just a minute ago, and I can only share full screen, so I can't see anyone. So if you do the hands, and hopefully Matt will be able to relay the questions to me, or we can just wait until the end and have a Q&A sesh. So let's load up the slideshow from beginning. Ooh. Try that again. So hopefully everyone can see that first slide. If not, then let me know. Welcome. My name is Morgan, and today I'm going to be sharing some words, I guess, some images, and some ideas with you. And I've called the talk Beyond the Binary, which hopefully will begin to make sense as we go along. But first, as a kind of abstract way of introducing a key area that I'm going to be talking about, I'd like to propose a slightly repetitive and rhetorical question. So, is this blue? 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 Or is this blue? And at what point does it become green? And in isolation, and without any classification of green, these hues could easily be described as blue. And why is all of this just not called GRU? So there's no denying that classification is something that comes naturally to us as human beings, and is an essential skill in the development of cognitive abilities. However, although essential, classification can also lead to what's termed binary thinking, which I'll be exploring throughout the presentation. But first, before we move on, I'd just like to bring awareness to any colorblind folk that we have here today. And I'd like everyone to imagine what it might be like for them to sit through this first slide, is it uncomfortable, confused, annoyed, perhaps? And in Britain, we have approximately 3 million colorblind people. This is a good example of classification not suiting everyone. And also, if you are colorblind, I apologize for dragging you through that experience. Okay, so a bit, the who, why, what, where, when. A bit about me, I guess. So, I'm Morgan. I'm genderqueer. I take they, them pronouns. And I've purposely given up my identity and LGBT+ status here as to be fully transparent, but also because on a daily basis, queer people don't often get the opportunity to have their identity acknowledged or sometimes even accepted. So first, a few things may need addressing. Firstly, my use of the word queer. Secondly, the term genderqueer. And lastly, the pronouns they and them. So queer was initially seen as a derogative term, but it's now firmly been snatched back. It's now worn as a badge of pride by people who embrace their queerness in a multitude of gorgeous ways. And genderqueer is a more relatively new term. Hopefully by the end of the day, you'll kind of have more of an understanding of what it means. However, for now, I'd just kindly ask everyone to park that alongside the pronouns a bit later on. A good question, maybe what qualifies me here to be here today talking to you? I could show you some fancy certificates, talk about degrees, masters and stuff, but ultimately what's led me here is my lived experience as a non-binary person, LGBT+ person. Okay, however, it's important for me to acknowledge my work as a therapist, and particularly my work with young people over the last 5-6 years, and that's really kind of been important in my own journey. So what am I going to be kind of talking about today? So gender, sexuality and relationship diversity. Often with the acronym GSRD, you might see a lot of organizations using that at the moment. And I'll also be talking about language. And given by title, I'll be talking about binary concepts, kind of going into LGBT plus bit of history and awareness. And then hopefully by the end, I'll be able to answer following questions. So what is binary thinking? Why is it limiting? Why should we care? And how can we all be more understanding and inclusive? Okay, so first, an important definition. What do we mean by the term binary? So there's the adjective, which is relating to or composed of, involving two things. There's the noun, which refers to a binary system of classification, one by which each group and subgroup is perpetually divided into two, one with a positive and the other with a negative character. So keep this in mind as we move through the upcoming slides. So now we have a kind of clear definition of a binary concept. Let's have a look at some pervasive cultural and societal binaries. So firstly, a bit of a trigger warning of sorts. You may see yourself or identify with some of these. You may also disagree, and that's okay. I'm kind of generalizing and looking at the overall cultural views here. So yeah, good and bad. So this binary in itself is the foundation of binary thinking. It underlies all the others that follow in this list. And our experiences, our thoughts, feelings, all get categorized in this way. We see it in every story ever told. It's taught to us from a young age, through what's right, wrong, naughty, and nice. And it also kind of, goes into this next one, which is the idea of normal or abnormal and weird. This is particularly present when considering sexuality, which I will be talking more about a bit later on. And then there's no denying that within these next few, there's been some wonderful progress in recent times. Yet the fact that throughout the world, patriarchal systems are still so ingrained in our societies. You can see that the male-female binary is still ever present. So LGBT plus phobia, again, still such an issue, and the fact that being gay is still a criminal offence in some parts of the world. Is in fact criminal. So yeah, the straight gay binary. And then the Black Lives Matter and all that's happened in recent times should be enough to show everyone that the white, black, people of colour binary is still very strong. Disableism isn't as well represented, but it's certainly still a thing. Some others, we've got the relationship versus single bias, and it may not seem as obvious, but again, this is kind of rather systemic, with often joining forces with the patriarchy as well to again favour men. So think of the dashing bachelor versus the desperate spinster. And then with all of these, and especially with the rise of the internet, we can often view any binary as a simplified version of us versus them. I did come up with some others there which are maybe a bit less obvious. Yeah, mind, body, sane, mentally ill, beautiful, ugly, young, old, rich, poor, national, immigrant. There's a few ideas that I was throwing around there. So here's a tool that I'm going to be kind of referring back to throughout. Here we have a gender-bred person. Use this a lot with young people, but also use it a lot with parents and stuff as well in the past. It's a really good tool for kind of showing that we will have kind of these sliding scales to show various elements of someone's identity. So in there, we've got the gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And there's been, quite a strong evolution of language and understanding and acceptance kind of more recently, which again, I'll be talking more about. And I've kind of listed a few sexual orientations here. So I've got asexual, bisexual, gay, heterosexual, lesbian, pansexual, queer, questioning, unsure. Oh, go back. So these are just a few. It's not extensive. I think interestingly, so in my work for an organisation that works in just young people mental health, we obviously gather data, and we're finding that more and more young people are ticking the unsure box, which I find quite fascinating and quite empowering almost, because I think that kind of straight gay binary has been so strong for so long, you know, particularly when I was younger, I would definitely not have gone, yeah, I'm just unsure. It would have been felt like I had to be either or. We probably wouldn't have had a box called unsure either, would we? So yeah, things have definitely evolved and moved on. Okay, but yeah, we'll refer back to this gender person to move on. So here we have the Kinsey scale. So Alfred Kinsey, the creator of this scale, he's often called the father of sexual revolution. And the Kinsey scale was created in order to demonstrate that sexuality does not fit into two strict categories, which is homosexual, heterosexual. Instead, Kinsey believed that sexuality is fluid and subject to change over time. And this is all well and good. However, the scale really only focused on behavior and does not encapsulate the various other aspects that could make up someone's sexuality. And it's also important to note that this ultimately depends on how we define sex. This is perhaps one area where heteronormativity has largely influenced how we see sexuality, whereby the act of a penis penetrating a vagina is the standard or normal definition of sex. Hopefully you understand what I mean by heteronormativity, can't even say it. But yeah, it's the idea that heterosexual kind of straight sexuality and all of that encompasses is kind of the normal, and that's what we assume to be the case. And in my kind of queer circles, it's something that comes up all the time when people refer. We all find it hilarious when people refer to, you know, people having gay sex or lesbian sex, you know, as if it's this hugely different thing, which really kind of shows, yeah, where that kind of heteronormativity comes in. So yeah, that's the scale of where you can see kind of 0 to 6, or the X down this end of the spectrum, which would be kind of asexual, which describes someone who's not sexual or doesn't have sexual desire. Okay, so the idea of sexual, well, this used to be called the sexual trichotomy, I think, sexuality trichotomy. So you had, this is what people think made up someone's sexuality. So you've got sexual identity, sexual attraction, and sexual behavior. But for me and a lot of other people, this really doesn't do it justice, kind of going back to that idea of the Kinsey scale again. So, you know, what about sexual fantasies, emotional attraction, and also romantic attraction? You know, someone could be heterosexual in their behavior and yet have vastly homosexual fantasies. They could be emotionally attracted to same sex, but romantically attracted to the opposite sex. So yeah, how do we define sexuality is really important. You know, we've got the kind of biological dimensions, so kind of gender, genetics, reproduction, fertility, sexual arousal, response, physiological, physical appearance, growth, development. We've also got the psychological dimension, so yeah, emotions, experiences, motivation, expressiveness, and then the socio-cultural dimension, so kind of religious influences, multicultural influences, socio-economic influences, ethical influences, lots and lots of things that can kind of really go into this. It's not as clear binary, this or that is what we're trying to show here. So hopefully that's useful. Everyone loves a Venn diagram. Okay, so this is why I like the idea of what's called dimensions of sexuality. So here we have the gender-bred person again. And here we've got, kind of the sliding scales again. But you see on this one, the sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to are different here. That's important to note. So for some, I kind of talked about the kind of psychosocial factors. And for some, their sexuality may be fixed. You know, I would argue that this goes against the rules of human nature, whether we call it evolution or not. We can't ignore the fact that change is inevitable. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. You're not the same person you were yesterday, or even 9 o'clock this morning. And this is true on a metaphysical level, as much as it is on a purely physical one. So on average, 1 million cells in your body die, I think, every 1 second. So that means in one day, 24 hours, approximately 1.2 kilograms of cells die. That's like a whole bag of sugar. So now, although during this time we will have had just a lesser amount of cells spring to life in replacement, bringing awareness to the impermanence of all things, and thus making it ever clearer that each day we are, in fact, edging closer to death. It also manifests as a beautiful reminder, I think anyway, of our true transient nature. So referring back to this gender-bred person, for example, some are fixed, can be fluid, changing over a lifetime or daily. I've worked with young people that their gender identity or their sexuality has changed from day to day. Using this, the gender-bred kind of scales here, for example, I can look back at, say, my life, for example, and see how these aspects of my sexuality and gender have changed and evolved over time, and I still feel we're kind of still evolving. A binary expression of sexuality does not capture all of the dimensions that make up sexuality. And again, coming back to the idea of young people. So according to recent research, 1 in 6 Gen Z identify as LGBT plus, and 49% of people aged between 18 and 24 identify as something other than 100% heterosexual. So more than half of LGBT plus adults identify as bisexual, which is interesting. It's actually the largest segment, let's say, of the pride flag, and yet bisexual or bi-visibility is still kind of widespread. And again, I think binary thinking has led to this. My experience, for instance, growing up, I remember my first sexual experiences with a same-sex partner. They were continuously trying to convince me, the classic "buy now, gay later." I think that it's still very strong, and only now are we seeing more bi representation and appreciation in TV shows, for instance. I don't know if any Marvel fans here, but Loki in a recent episode has just come out as bi and gender fluid, so that's amazing to see. Okay, so moving on. So let's talk a bit about sex, and more specifically biological sex. So this refers to the biological and physiological characteristics that define the male or female binary. So you can see them there in the list. These are the kind of characteristics that people use in the biological, physiological ways to show female, male. And it's often described as being determined or resolute, and this biological determinism refers to the idea that human behavior is innate and directly determined by genes, brain size, or other biological attributes, such as this list. And this theory stands in contrast to the notion that human behavior is determined by our upbringing, our culture, or other social and environmental factors. So you could think of the classic nature versus nurture debate, for example. So a question that I always like to ask is, do the bodies we are born with define us? So a good way of kind of exploring this is, does someone who loses a leg in an accident become less human, or automatically have 17.5% less personality? Does a woman who has a hysterectomy or a mastectomy become less of a woman? Does a man that has an orchiotomy, that's the testicles, by the way, I had to look that one up, are they less of a man? So there's numerous examples of people naturally or otherwise not sitting within these parameters. So divergent levels of sex cells and reproductive anatomy that can ultimately affect the ability to reproduce. So again, less of a man or woman. The birth control pill and steroids, these all extremely affect the levels of hormones in bodies. So ultimately, we should be looking at biological sex just as with the gradients of blue earlier. As such, in every one of these categories and more, every body is different. So yeah, let's talk a bit about non-binary bodies. Yeah, so it's another problematic binary. So just as mentioned before, many people are born or develop in between this binary, and this is what we call intersex. So 1 to 2% of the general population sit outside this binary. So even within the biological aspect of sex, this demonstrates that a binary concept is just not fit for purpose. And perhaps you're thinking, 1 to 2%, that's such a minuscule number. Yet that works out approximately 156 million people. That's, bear in mind, the population of Russia is 145 million. We like us just ignoring all Russians and saying they don't exist. Yeah, so I think it's just an interesting kind of stat to look at. So, but this is not just, often people talk about just the genitals in terms of intersex, but it's not always the case. We've got some chromosomal and hormonal figures here that show how intersex, how varied it can be. And I've only taken a few from a much larger list, and the numbers can vary. But it's important to note that not all countries give stats, plus in some places corrective surgery is a standard practice and often done without consent. Yeah, and I could have listed a whole load of stats here, but I didn't want people to get lost within them. But yeah, I think the most important one is just to note that, that kind of 1 to 2% of the population. So yeah, the kind of research conducted by the World Health Organization said that 81% of individuals who have been subjected to surgeries due to their intersex diagnosis, almost 50% of participants reported psychological problems, and 2/3 of the adult participants drew a connection between sexual problems and their history of surgical treatment. So the idea of intersex being quite connected to non-binary, although in some cases there is a relationship between them, their identities, it's nowhere direct correlation, as many people continue to live their lives as an intersex male or female person. Okay, so having pulled apart the biological aspects of gender, let's now consider the other elements within the battle of the sexes. Let's talk about gender. So what do we mean by gender? This refers to the range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between femininity and masculinity. So depending on the context, these characteristics may include biological sex, sex-based social structures, or gender identity. So there's no denying that biology plays a big part in gender, as we've just discussed. For some, and perhaps the majority of people, their biological sex and gender are perfectly aligned with the binary concept of male or female. Yet what are male and female? Surely how we define these will obviously impact on whether we see ourselves as identifying as one or the other, or more importantly, both, neither, or something entirely different. So keen astrologers amongst us here may have noticed the planets here and perhaps got the reference from the well-trodden trope of men being from Mars, women being from Venus. Until Elon Musk pulls their finger out, this most definitely isn't the case. So yeah, what is gender then? We've kind of covered this a little bit when we talked about sexuality, but it's a biopsychosocial construct. So that kind of covers the biological, psychological, and social aspects, which we have here. And as anyone that's ever been part of a family or been in a relationship or just explored the inner workings of their own brain can attest, us human beings are very complex, let's say. So how can a binary concept possibly encompass all of these intricacies? Unless you're a computer spitting out zeros and ones, or a light switch, perhaps, I would suggest that the answer is it's just not possible. Surely a binary concept cannot be applied to the human condition. And to back this up, let me share some amazing research from two neuroscientists who've written an amazing book called The Gender Mosaic. So here we have a little snippet of some of their research that they did, which has been replicated numerous times. And it takes random individuals, both female, male, and each of these cells you can see here represents the score for one of 7 psychological characteristics that are often used to differentiate between sexes. So we have in dark pink, the highly feminine, and in the dark blue, highly masculine. And as you can see, there are average differences between the genders, and sometimes they even align with the classic stereotypes. But average women and men are almost impossible to find. And if you can, you could zoom in, and you notice that each individual has what the research eloquently describe as being a gender mosaic, whereby their characteristics are not set according to their biological sex. So not any one of these individuals is identical, and we've got quite a huge mix in there. And the fact that gender is often described as a myth doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It certainly does, but not as an intrinsic set of qualities, but as a social system that attributes meaning to sex, assigning different roles, status, and power to males and females. It's important to note that, what about society's roles on, making these people feel that they have these characteristics? That's an important thing to recognize. Okay. But yeah, it's a wonderful book. If anyone wants to read it, it's really quite small, but it's a really, really good book. Okay, so
Morgan,
yes, hello.
I might have a question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I'm just thinking about relevance to some of the projects that I work on. So, for example, registration being one of them. And in the product that I'm working on, we're actually removing that kind of Mr. Mrs. question because we see it as almost irrelevant actually to the data you're capturing. But as an aside from that, should we actually be even asking those sorts of questions now? Because obviously that could exclude a group, right? Should we be sort of readdressing or actually not asking those questions at all?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on what you're trying to gain from gathering that information. I for one still have issues when I come across the tick boxes and it doesn't have my gender identity in there. So I think the answer would be if you need to gather data on the people that you're coming to your organization or service, then you need to then just expand the questions to encapsulate all genders, all gender identities. Yeah, but if you don't necessarily need that data, then maybe scrap it.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope that helps. Yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about gender diversity here. And a lot of people, when they come up against this, think this is all a very new thing, it's like a fad or a phase. But historic gender expression was not binary. Let's join me on a quick journey through time and space and land in ancient Egypt, the hip and happening 1460s of the before Christ edition. And who's that strutting their stuff down Main Street? It's only Queen Hatshepsut. But wait, isn't she wearing a pharaonic headdress only worn by men? And hold on a darn minute, I can see her full naked torso. How scandalous. And side note, historians and linguists believe this may have been the first time anyone muttered the words, "Yes, Queen," but this has not been verified, so don't take my word for that. But yeah, here we have an image of the Queen herself. And although not depicted in this image, she's often depicted and shown sporting a beautifully groomed beard, interestingly. So although Egypt's gender roles were not quite strict, they were quite strict and sexist by modern standards, you could say they were the OG when it comes to gender expression and identity, with third gender categories and androgyny as far as the eye could see. So you only need to take a look at their gods for proof. In fact, their first god, Atum, would today be defined as a non-binary asexual powerhouse serving up Heliopolis omnipotent realness. And interestingly, although they embody the essence and capabilities of both sexes, history books still use the pronoun he when describing them, but a bit more on masculine pronoun bias later on. So moving now to the ancient Greeks and the Roman Empire, where, let's face it, sexual inhibitions weren't really a thing. But this was not just about sex, though, as their gender identity and expression were also incredibly diverse, with cross-dressing, as it's often called, being quite a normal experience and seen throughout Greek mythology. Even that absolute hunk Hercules was known to prance around in ladies' undies from time to time. And I'm not making this up, yet somehow this didn't make the cult classic Disney film. I wonder why. Okay, so it's also important to note that it's often been the involvement of the West that has shaped and changed gender norms through the ages. This can be seen with Native American tribes that prior to Western contact had third gender roles and identities, such as what we now refer to as two-spirit. So Indian texts from as early as 3,000 years ago also document the third gender. This is now backed by evidence cited by many scholars who have identified a multitude of genders and multi-gender roles throughout the world, spreading across the continents and the timeline of our history. Now, again, perhaps you may be thinking, well, surely the good old West and its not so soft approach to religious conversion wasn't that bad. However, as a way of proving my point, the map here on the slide depicts in white the countries that the British have never invaded. And bear in mind, one of these is Vatican City. It may be useful to consider how gender norms and stereotypes have changed in more recent times across our societies. So looking back at fashions, job roles, interests, activities, you can see how things shift and often align with what is normal for the time. Consider Elizabethan England, for example. Considered one of the most prudish eras, maybe, on record, yet men wearing wigs, makeup and ornamental necklaces and high heels wouldn't even have turned a head. As someone that's been verbally and physically attacked for wearing clothes that do not align with what is normal, I've always had quite a, I've always been baffled by gendered clothing. Plus, again, I would also like to point out that often within fashion there's a male superiority, so females stepping into the masculine has always been more accepted. We see this on runways, but it's more pervasive in young children. Girls are more accepted for their tomboy-like identities, where boys are called sissies and pansies. So clothing is quite an important thing, because it's often a very important outward expression of our personality or our gender expression. So I'd like to explore that maybe a bit more. So let's go back to the genderbread person again. And we've kind of explored certain areas of sexuality and gender. And just remember that biological sex and what we kind of shared earlier regarding intersex, so this could be seen to be more female, male, or somewhere in between. Their gender identity, which again may fit with being more male, female, or non-binary, gender fluid, which is how I identify. And it's interesting, again, yes, some days I feel more feminine, some days I feel more masculine. But that's whether maybe I decide to put some makeup on or wear a certain color. And it's interesting because why are makeup and colors considered any kind of gender at all? It's a ridiculous thing when you think about it. It's so ingrained that, for instance, if I wear something pink, I feel a bit more feminine. Why is that? You know, that's that idea of, well, going back to the kind of gender mosaic. It's important to note again that who we're sexually and romantically attracted to is separate from the other elements. You know, all of these elements are on spectrums again, so meaning that they can change over time. Again, changing daily, which is especially true when talking about gender identity and expression, but maybe also, sexuality as well. So now hopefully you've kind of got more of an idea of some of the limitations of binary thinking. And I'd also like to move on to, the idea of kind of spectrums is kind of great, but I still think it sometimes falls short of the mark and doesn't seem to cover everyone's experience. And this is why the term being used now is dimensions, so dimensions of sexuality and gender. Let me show you what I mean. Slide is not going on. So again, apologies to any colorblind people we have in the here. But what we have here is a pink to blue gradient across the screen. So this would be a kind of idea of a binary. So how do we go from that to this, which would be the traditional pride flag, with all of the colors representing different things. And then now we have the progressive flag, pride flag, which adds in the trans identities and people of color as well to show appreciation for their lives. And then perhaps we need to go from that to something like this or this, which might seem a bit of a mess. And how do you put that into a flag? But I guess that's what I'm trying to show here, is that, within someone's identity, you may have just a myriad of amazing different colors. So here's some things that I think are quite helpful in terms of, particularly in terms of gender. So I like the idea of the one on the right here. What does non-binary actually mean? And you've got the binary male and female, and then non-binary, all over that circle describe that it can mean different things to different people. And then again on the left here, you've got kind of a nice Venn diagram to show different elements of someone's gender. And again, considering fashion, male superiority, women express their gender, say for instance, by stepping into the masculine. It's often seen as being kind of powerful and commanding. So think of business attire, and other times they can dress in ways that make them feel attractive, which often means much more stereotypically feminine attire. So again, these are really interesting things, how we're kind of putting these things into these categories of masculine and feminine. Okay, so just quickly go into kind of a bit about language and pronouns. So gender neutral pronouns, as the ones that I use, are defined as providing an identity for a singular person who does not identify as he or him, or she or her. So in English, the word they is used as a gender neutral singular pronoun, even though some critics argue that they should really only be used to refer to plural nouns. However, it is already widely used within the normal vernacular and everyday conversation. And these identifiers are nothing new and have actually been used throughout the history of literature. For example, the singular use of they being used to describe someone's features as early as 1386 in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and also in famous works such as Hamlet and Pride and Prejudice. However, it's from the 18th century onwards that people started using male pronouns when describing someone of a non-specific gender in writing, and this marks the time when opinions of what pronouns should be used started to change. So particularly in academic writing, you'll see he used, supposed to refer to males or females, and it became kind of standard practice. It's kind of more recent though that they, them pronouns have become more of a development. And the practice of using pronouns in a non-binary way, has kind of exploded within the kind of LGBT communities, and is really flourishing, particularly online. For example, as we see people using them in their social media platforms in their bios. And this list here, I didn't want to confuse everyone by doing an extensive list, but this kind of covers the main ones used, they, them. You also have variants on sie, zir, zim, which is a lot of talk at the moment about them, because in other language, like in German, the words sie and or I can't remember which one actually refers to he or him. So there's a confusion. So at the moment, they're still trying to figure some out. But I think the best kind of thing to do with pronouns is just let someone tell you their pronouns. And I think, one argument that's often cited against the use of these pronouns, these new pronouns and other trans positive language, is that it's too difficult to learn and remember. Yet humans are, quite remarkable in their capacity to learn new words. For example, think of all of the very recent words and terms that have arisen through technology, the internet and instant messaging. So when new words can bring us closer to something that we want to say, then we're more than happy to use them. Similar to clothing, another thing that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine is a gendered language, which is something that affects a quarter of dialects spoken across the world. This has always baffled me, and probably the main reason why I struggled so much to learn French, German, and Spanish at various times in my life. And ultimately why I'm still one of those ignorant English people who just points and talks louder when abroad, unfortunately. For example, in German, a person's mouth, neck, elbows, fingers, nails, feet are all male, and a person's nose, lips, shoulders, hands, and toes are female. The hair, eyes, ears, chin, legs, knees don't have any sex at all. And in French, why are computers male and bottles female? And the use of keys here wasn't just a simple pun. And there's been research to show that in Spanish or another language where the word key is feminine, it's more likely to be described as intricate, little, and lovely, whereas in German or another language in which key is masculine, words such as strong, metal, and jagged are used more often. So also in these gendered language, the masculine usually supersedes the feminine, which again shows the power dynamic within the binary system. More importantly, I think, on average, countries where gendered languages are spoken have ranked lowest on the scale of gender equality. So for me, it's easy to see how the language we use shapes the world we create. As an example, I'd like to return to the concept of colour we used earlier. So in many languages, the colours described in English as blue and green are collexified and expressed using a single term. So as a callback to earlier, is described by linguists using the word grew, without this actually being part of the English lexicon. So yeah, this is grew. But these words and classifications don't simply reflect what we see, as multiple experiments and research suggest that they influence our perception. And this again is very fluid and changeable over time. So for example, Greek speakers who have two fundamental color terms to describe light and dark blue are more prone to see these two colors as more similar after living for long periods of time within the UK, where these two colors are described in English by the same fundamental color, blue. So to summarize my main point, the binary classifications, such as gay, straight, male or female, alongside all of their written and unwritten social divisions clearly have an impact on how we go about our everyday lives. So using the above example, perhaps within the flourishing of the gender equivalent of grew, that being non-binary and genderqueer, we'll all hopefully begin to be free from the restrictions that are placed and forced upon us by squeezing us into either a pink or a blue box. So just like to mention here a Tolstoy quote that I love, because I want everyone to think that I'm smart. The subject of history is the life of peoples, and of humanity. To catch and pin down in words, that is, to describe directly the life, not only of humanity, but of it, even of a single people, appears to be impossible. So I think I agree with this to some extent, yet words are all we have. So long as we can allow everyone to express themselves, share their feelings, and speak their truth. And I think this is why I believe that binary thinking is limiting and problematic. So language is a powerful tool that can either imprison us or transform us. So when we fix ideas and say that something is like this or like this and nothing in between, we're not only ignoring a myriad of beautiful possibilities, we're shutting down the experience of those that do find themselves existing outside of these binaries. You know, thinking about the idea of colorblind people again, for example, you know, we don't discriminate them and say they can't come in certain places or use them on the internet. So why do we do it for LGBT plus statuses maybe and other binaries? Okay, so this is always important to kind of cover the idea of.
Morgan,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We have about 5 minutes left, and I know there's quite a few questions that have come through.
Okay,
so
I think I've got like one more slide after this. So yeah.
Perfect.
So yeah, just talk conscious bias and also privilege and intersectionality. I think most people are kind of aware of that, but it's important to note that, you know, my experience as a white middle working class person who's lived most of my life as a male passing person has had a rather privileged existence. So the idea of intersectionality. So if I'd, you know, for instance, been a different race, class, had a long-term illness or disability, my life would be potentially more difficult. So yeah, always important to kind of cover those. Yeah, lastly, just the idea of being an ally. So how do we do this? And I really love, again, another Venn diagram, the idea of where empathy, knowledge, and action all intersect. Because, you know, we can have the knowledge and not do the action part, so it's just performative, or we can have do the action but not have the end of empathy, so it's not. Anyway, you can see. So yeah, what we need to do, use the right names, use the right pronouns. And many people are afraid of getting it wrong, but that means they're scared to get it right. So remember, it's okay to ask. And for me, many trans or non-binary people, the preference is to be politely asked rather than awkwardly trying out of embarrassment to guess or get it be incorrect. But yeah, do some research, read books, talk to people, and have conversations, and do things like this. And that is my talk. Thank you.
Perfectly timed, Morgan. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I am one of those colorblind people, but it was really interesting what you just said. You know, I wasn't excluded from running a design agency for years. So I very much appreciate that last comment. And whilst the charts look confusing to me, I definitely appreciate the importance and relevance. But so there's a few questions that have come through, predominantly, I think, around pronouns. So I'm going to try and group them together a little bit. So you mentioned to let someone tell you their pronouns and politely ask, you know, what they like to be referred to as. But some people may be nervous maybe about how they address someone. Like, what advice would you give to someone that really wants to do the right thing, but they're also really conscious of getting it wrong and not wanting to offend someone?
Yeah, I guess it's about language and intent. You know, there's a huge difference between saying, "Are you a man or a woman?" and saying, "What are your pronouns?" for example. And yeah, asking what someone's pronouns isn't a big deal, really. I think it's about making it more widespread. So yeah, it flourishing online and in bios. So as organizations, you know, you can put them in your social media platforms, email, footers, signatures. When you do events, name badges, pronouns underneath. It's just about kind of normalizing it, ultimately. I think this arose in my work, for instance, where someone didn't want to put their pronouns on their email signature for the fear of people thinking they were trans, because only surely a trans person would need to say, I am female, which again shows the issues here. What's wrong with being trans, right? So hopefully that helps. But yeah, I'm very aware that it can feel really uncomfortable, and people still get my pronouns wrong. People slip up. It's okay. It's not a big deal. As long as people are trying, I think is the key.
That's important, absolutely. So there was a follow-up question, which I think you sort of answered there, but lots of organizations like LinkedIn, Instagram, etc., are inviting people to upload their pronouns. So should we be actively encouraging colleagues to put them in their email signatures, for example, or is it kind of, leave that up to them to make that decision themselves, or what do you think about that? Not forced, I suppose, is probably the question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to force anyone to do anything really, but suggestions are always there. And if they say no, that's a perfect invitation for a conversation about why. And this is the idea of, diversity, inclusion, and equality. It's about having these difficult conversations and these uncomfortable conversations ultimately, because that's how we progress, right?
Yeah, it starts the conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there was a couple questions similar along these lines. I know Carmen asked through the chat, do we feel that adding pronouns is something that needs to be earned, maybe in the same way that companies should not just be using the pride flag for a bit of, excuse the comment, I guess, but flag waving, when they've actually maybe not done very much to actually support that community? Some people maybe, I don't know, jumping on the bandwagon and kind of, it's Pride Month, let's put rainbows up everywhere. But then actually the other 300 and whatever that is, 31 days of the year, they do nothing to support the community. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Pride has certainly, yes, is it problematic? I mean, it's obviously there for a reason, but it's become more and more hashtag straight pride. I think if you go to the in Brighton, for instance, the parade, you'll see all of these companies like Barclays and British Airways, and it is again, like you say, what are they actually doing, other than it's just an advertisement space ultimately. But to answer the question, I think that as long as we're normalizing it with the pronouns, which I think is the key. So yeah, I think that if more and more organizations are doing it, then that's better.
Yeah, definitely agree on that. Okay, well, just before I do a close, has anyone else got any questions that they'd like to ask Morgan this morning? I'll leave that for a moment, or please do add them into the chat. But Morgan, thank you so much for your time this morning. I know I've learned a lot and really appreciate you taking the time for us today. I think there's a number of slides that I'd love to reshare if we could, things like the genderbread. For example, I'd not seen that term before, so I think that was really fascinating. So lots there that I think we can take in, so really appreciate that. Thank you. And then thank you all for watching and listening. Don't forget that AEO has just launched its new free resource. I put the link in the chat on diversity and inclusion, so it's available on the AEO Hub, so please do go and check that out. But otherwise, maybe Morgan, if people want to find out more about you or follow you, where would you like to point them to?
Good question. Yeah, I'm quite don't like social media, so
Okay.
I've got an Instagram for my therapy page, but other than that, I am on LinkedIn actually, so that's the new modern one, isn't it, that us adults are using. So find me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah, super. Yeah, not forcing people to follow you, but some may love to stay in touch. But no, well, thank you again, Morgan. Really appreciate your time this morning, and Sarah,
Right.
Chris, for setting this up for everyone. I think there's a lot we can do to carry on the conversation. So thank you very much, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all face to face somewhere soon as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Morgan. That was great on behalf of the G&I group. Thanks so much, and thanks, Matt, for hosting at the last minute.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate that. Go well.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
I think Chris might be on another call, so don't worry about him.
I thought he might be clicked in. It's really interesting, eh?
Oh, it's fascinating, really fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah,
really good. Yeah, there's a few, I had a few messages saying they found it really interesting. So yes, that's good.
yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, if you need anything else like this, I'd love to do this kind of thing. So as you well know, so just
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to have you on board, and it's good to know that you're willing to help. That's because you've been doing loads of it for ages as well. So that's great.
I kind of sort of found my feet through pandemic with doing all the podcast type stuff and stuff. So
Yeah,
really,
yeah. No, it's great. I mean, I can't do stuff like that. I'm just not so good at thinking on my feet, but no, you're really good at it. So thank you.
well, yeah. So if you need anything else, just give us a shout. Happy to.
Will do. We definitely will, and we'll hold you to that, won't we, Zara?
Yeah, no problem. What's next for you guys then? You've got the soiree still? Is that going ahead?
Yeah, that's the 21st of July. We're 100 years old this year, so we want to do a 100-year party.
Yeah.
And we're hoping to do that in December.
Okay.
We're just kind of going through bits and pieces at the moment to try and get it together. But that's kind of it really in terms of events. It's not going to be a conference. We're doing everything online.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. All right, I need to shoot because I've got another call.
Yes,
shortly.
I know you have. Yeah. So thanks again for stepping in last
No
minute.
worries. Yeah, lovely
Okay.
to be involved. All right, guys.
Bye.
See you
All
later.
right, Zara. Okay,
Bye.
see you later. Bye.